Far out beyond the western edge of Scotland, where the Atlantic moves in long, dark folds, there is a small island of grass, rock, and silence. At night, in the winter of 1900, a light was meant to shine there. It was not a town light, not a window light, not the warm glow of a street or a house at the end of a lane. It was a lighthouse beam, built for sailors who might never see the island itself, but would trust the warning it gave. Every few moments, the light was meant to turn across the sea, white, then darkness, white, then darkness. A simple rhythm, a promise. But one December night, a passing ship noticed something wrong. The island was there. The rocks were there. The sea was moving as it always had. But the light was gone. At first, it was only an absence. A missing flash where a flash should have been. A dark shape in bad weather. A note made by men at sea who still had their own voyage to complete. Days passed. The weather held back the relief boat, and when at last another crew reached the island, no one came down to meet them. No figure appeared on the path. No hand waved from the landing. No keeper opened the door. Inside the lighthouse, ordinary things remained. Beds, lamps, clothing, clocks. The signs of daily work. The quiet evidence of men who had been there and then were not. 3 men had vanished from a place with almost nowhere to vanish to, and more than a century later, the question still moves with the tide. What happened on that island in those missing days before Christmas? Welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story is a calm true crime mystery from the edge of the North Atlantic. It is a real case, drawn from documented records, official inquiry, lighthouse history, and the careful work of archivists and historians who have tried to separate fact from legend. As always, this episode is told slowly and respectfully, with no graphic detail, no shock, and no invented evidence. It is meant for quiet listening, for nighttime, for a black screen, or simply for a still hour when you want to follow a mystery without being pulled too sharply awake. Tonight, we travel to the Flannan Isles, a remote group of islands west of the Isle of Lewis, and to the disappearance of 3 lighthouse keepers in December of 1900. Their names were James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur. They were working men, family men, trained for a lonely and demanding job. They were not characters in a ghost story, though many ghost stories would later gather around them. They were real people, doing real work in a place where the weather could change the meaning of every decision. So, let us begin with the island. The Flannan Isles lie west of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland. They are not large islands. They do not form a sheltered harbour or a busy settlement. They rise from the Atlantic as a scatter of cliffs, slopes, seabirds, and rock. The largest island in the group is Eilean Mòr. By the end of the 19th century, the sea lanes around this part of Scotland were important and dangerous. Ships moved through waters where fog, darkness, storm, and hidden rock could turn a journey into a disaster. For that reason, the Northern Lighthouse Board built a lighthouse on Eilean Mòr. It was designed by David Allen Stevenson, part of the famous Stevenson family of lighthouse engineers. The light first shone in December of 1899, only about a year before the mystery began. Imagine the work it took to build there. There were no easy roads, no village nearby, no convenient harbour where carts could roll up from a pier. Materials had to be landed from boats and hauled up from the sea. The lighthouse itself stood high above the water, a white tower with keeper accommodation attached, built to endure weather that could be difficult even on calmer days. The job of a lighthouse keeper was steady, repetitive, and serious. The light had to be maintained, the lens had to be kept clean, fuel and equipment had to be watched, the machinery had to be checked, records had to be kept, weather readings had to be taken. Domestic life had to be orderly, because order was one of the few defenses against isolation. A lighthouse was a workplace, a home, and a safety system all at once. The men stationed there worked in rotation. One keeper might be on shore leave, while others remained on the island. Relief visits brought supplies, news, letters, and a change of personnel. In a remote station, the arrival of the relief boat was not a small thing. It was contact with the rest of the world. In December 1900, the three men on duty were James Ducat, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, an assistant keeper, and Donald McArthur, the occasional keeper. MacArthur was not originally scheduled as one of the regular three at that time. He was standing in because another keeper, William Ross, was away sick. Joseph Mòr, another assistant keeper, was on shore duty and was due to return with the relief vessel. James Ducat was experienced and trusted. Thomas Marshall was also a trained keeper. Donald McArthur had experience as well, and the official record identifies him as the occasional keeper on duty in place of the sick man. They were living in close quarters, in winter, on a bare island in the Atlantic. Their days would have been shaped by routine, the morning chores, the cleaning, the checking of the lamp, the preparation of meals, the weather entries, the careful watching of the sea. Not as scenery, but as a force that decided when boats could land, when supplies could be moved, and when the island was cut off. In a lighthouse, small details mattered. A door left open, a lamp not trimmed, a clock unwound, a rope unsecured, a landing place damaged. Any of these things could mean trouble. And the Flannan Isles had two principal landing places, east and west, each useful depending on weather and sea conditions. Around the island, there were steep slopes, cliffs and paths. There was also equipment used to move supplies from the landings up toward the lighthouse. The men knew the island. They knew the rules. They knew the sea. But knowing the sea does not mean controlling it. By mid-December, winter weather was already shaping the story. On December 15th, 1900, a steamer called the Arctur was passing through the area on a voyage from Philadelphia to Leith. In poor weather, those aboard noticed that the Flannan Isles light was not operating. That was the first recorded sign that something was wrong. But it did not immediately bring help to the island. The report took time to reach the proper authorities, and the relief vessel could not simply sail whenever it wished. Weather mattered. The sea mattered. The same conditions that may have caused the trouble also delayed the response. The relief vessel Hesperus was scheduled to reach the island around December 20th. But bad weather kept it back, so the island remained alone. For days, the light did not shine. And on the day after Christmas, the Hesperus finally approached Eilean Mòr. Strictly speaking, the Flannan Isles case is not a confirmed crime. No court ever proved that a crime occurred. No suspect was charged. No confession was given. No body was found. The official conclusion pointed toward accident rather than murder. But the case belongs in true crime history because it is a real disappearance, investigated officially, surrounded by questions, and preserved in public memory as one of the most enduring mysteries of the sea. On December 26, 1900, the Hesperus arrived at the Flannan Isles. Captain James Harvey brought the vessel close enough to look for signs of life. Normally, the keepers would be ready. They would know the relief boat was expected. Someone would likely come down toward the landing. There might be preparations for supplies. There might be the practical busyness of men who had been waiting for contact with shore. But there was nothing. No flag was flying. No provision boxes were set out for restocking. No keeper appeared. The crew sounded signals. They tried to draw attention. Still, there was no response. Joseph Mòr, the relief keeper, went ashore. He was the man who knew the routine from the inside. He knew what should be there and what should not. He climbed from the landing toward the station, moving through a quiet that must have felt heavier with every step. The lighthouse door was closed. Inside, he found no keepers. The building was not in chaos. The lamps had been cleaned and refilled. The domestic rooms were not signs of a violent struggle, but there were troubling details. The clocks had stopped. The beds were unmade. Some waterproof clothing was missing, while one set remained behind. The kitchen was orderly. Later accounts would grow more dramatic, adding details like a meal left untouched or a chair overturned. But Joseph Mòr's own account was more restrained. He described clean kitchen utensils, suggesting the men had left after a meal, not in the middle of one. That distinction matters. In mysteries like this, legends attach themselves to gaps. A clean kitchen becomes an interrupted dinner. A missing coat becomes a clue, with too much certainty placed upon it. A silent building becomes a stage for every fear the listener brings. But the actual scene was quieter, and perhaps that is why it is so unsettling. The lighthouse was not wrecked. It was simply empty. Mòr returned to report what he had found. Then he went back up with others from the Hesperus, and the search widened. They looked through the lighthouse. They looked across the island. They found no sign of Ducat, Marshall, or McArthur. The men had vanished from a small island surrounded by winter sea. Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board. Its message was direct and grave. A dreadful accident, he reported, had happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers had disappeared. No sign of life had been seen on arrival. A rocket had been fired, but no response came. Mòr had landed and found the station empty. Those words moved the case from silence into record. From that point forward, the disappearance belonged not only to the island, but to the authorities, the families, the lighthouse service, and eventually to history. The Hesperus could not simply leave the light unattended. Mòr and 3 volunteer seamen stayed behind to keep the station working. Think about that. The men who replaced the vanished keepers had to remain in the same building, on the same island, in the same weather, surrounded by the unanswered question of what had just happened. They had practical work to do. The light had to be restored. The station had to be managed. The sea did not pause for fear. But the atmosphere must have been difficult to ignore. The empty rooms, the missing coats, the stopped clocks, the knowledge that 3 trained men had been there only days earlier and were now nowhere to be found. On December 29th, 1900, Robert Muirhead, a superintendent with the Northern Lighthouse Board, arrived to investigate. Muirhead was not an outsider with only paperwork in his hands. He knew lighthouse work. He had recruited the missing men. He understood the routines and expectations of the service. He knew what a keeper should do, what rules should be followed, and what risks were part of the job. His inquiry focused on the condition of the station and the island. Inside the lighthouse, he noted that things were largely in order. The light had been prepared. The household did not show signs of panic or disorder. The absence of the men was the central fact, not a scene of obvious violence. Outside, the west landing told a different story. There was storm damage. Iron railings had been bent. A box used for ropes or equipment had been displaced. Other gear was damaged or missing. Muirhead found the destruction striking. He wrote that some of the damage was difficult to believe unless actually seen. That phrase has stayed with the case because it carries the weight of a practical man surprised by what the sea could do. The west landing was exposed. Waves could strike with extraordinary force. On rocky islands, the sea does not need to rise gently like water in a bath. It can explode upward, thrown by swell and cliff, reaching places that seem safe until the wrong combination of tide and wave arrives. Muirhead formed a theory. He believed that Ducat and Marshall may have gone down to the west landing to secure or inspect equipment during rough weather. McArthur may have remained behind at first, then seen something happen, or become concerned and gone out after them without taking his full waterproof clothing. The clothing detail mattered because one set of oilskins remained at the lighthouse. In bad weather, a keeper leaving without full protection suggested urgency. It also suggested that the last man may not have expected to be outside long. The official theory was that all 3 men were swept away by the sea. 1 or 2 may have been caught first. The 3rd may have rushed to help. Or all 3 may have been at the landing when a sudden large wave struck. No bodies were recovered. That is not unusual in violent Atlantic conditions around rocks and cliffs. But the absence of bodies left space for doubt. And doubt, in a case like this, becomes permanent. There were also questions about rules. Lighthouse regulations generally required that the light not be left unattended. If all 3 men left the station, especially in dangerous weather, that would have been a serious breach of procedure. But emergencies can bend rules. A loose box, damaged gear, or fear of losing equipment might have seemed urgent in the moment. A keeper might have believed he would be away only briefly. Another might have followed because something had gone wrong. These are human possibilities, not certainties. The official inquiry did not solve every detail. It could not replay the final minutes. It could only arrange the known facts into the most likely shape. There were no signs of intruders. There was no evidence that the men had left by boat. There was no proof of violence between them. There was no reliable evidence for the more dramatic stories that later entered the legend. And some of the famous details often repeated about the case are not supported by the strongest records. The supposed logbook entries describing strange behavior, men crying, or a terrible storm in emotional language are widely treated with skepticism by modern researchers. They do not fit well with the known official material. The same is true of the dramatic image of an untouched meal waiting on a table. The better supported account is quieter, clean utensils, an orderly kitchen, and men who likely left after eating. The mystery becomes clearer when we remove the decorations, but it does not disappear. 3 men were present. The light went out. Days later, the lighthouse was empty. The west landing was damaged. The sea was the strongest suspect. And still, there was no final proof. The Flannan Isles mystery remains unsolved because the final event had no witness. The island could not speak. The sea left damage, but not a full account. The lighthouse preserved traces of routine, but not the moment when routine broke. The official conclusion was reasonable. It remains the most grounded explanation. The men were likely swept away while dealing with storm damage or equipment at the landing. But several uncertainties keep the case alive. First, why did all 3 men leave the lighthouse? For safety and procedure, 1 keeper should have remained. If Ducat and Marshall went to the landing, why did McArthur go too? Did he see them in trouble? Did he hear a cry? Did he notice from above that something had happened? Did he rush out without oilskins because there was no time? Second, what exactly drew them to the west landing? The damage found there suggests severe wave action. Perhaps they were trying to secure a box or ropes. Perhaps they feared important equipment would be lost. Perhaps they inspected the damage after the worst had passed, only for another wave to arrive unexpectedly. Third, when did the disappearance happen? The Archtor noticed the light out on December 15th. The Hesperus did not arrive until December 26th. The stopped clocks and station details suggested the accident had happened days before the relief crew landed, but the exact timing remains uncertain. Those missing days are part of the mystery's power. Fourth, why were no remains found? The answer may be simple: the Atlantic. But emotionally, for families and for history, absence is difficult. A recovered body can confirm a death. Without one, the mind continues searching. And then there is the island itself. Remote places make mysteries feel larger. A disappearance in a crowded street leaves witnesses, noises, records, and contradictions. A disappearance on a small island leaves weather, rock, and silence. The Flannan Isles case was also shaped by the era. In 1900, there were no radios at the station sending immediate alerts, no CCTV, no satellite tracking, no emergency beacon on a coat. Communication depended on boats and weather. A lighthouse could fail, and the world might not fully understand why until days later. That delay gave the mystery room to grow. Newspapers and storytellers added atmosphere. Later, poems and retellings introduced details that blurred with fact. The lonely lighthouse became more than a workplace. It became a symbol. 3 men in a tower, the light going dark, the sea keeping its secret. But the real story is strong enough without invention. James Ducat had a wife and children. Donald McArthur had a wife and children. Thomas Marshall was a working lighthouse keeper, whose life ended, as far as we can tell, in service to the light. They deserve to be remembered not as props in a strange tale, but as men who were doing a difficult job in a dangerous place. The mystery is not only what happened to them, it is also how quickly ordinary life can narrow into one irreversible moment. A meal finished, a coat taken down, a door closed, a path descended, a wave rising where no one expected it to rise, and then only the lighthouse remained. Today, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse still stands on Eilean Mòr. It was automated in the 20th century, and the old rhythm of keepers living there has passed into history. The light no longer depends on men sleeping in the rooms below, waking to tend the lamp, watching weather and sea through long winter nights. But the story remains attached to the place, not loudly. Not like a scream, more like a question, carried in fog. When people speak of the Flannan Isles Mystery, they often ask, what strange force could remove 3 men from a lighthouse without leaving a clear trace? But perhaps the most haunting answer is also the most ordinary for that coast. The sea. The sea was always there. Beneath the cliffs, around the landings, under the paths, in the sound that filled the rooms when the wind was right. It was the reason the lighthouse existed, and perhaps the reason the keepers never came home. There is a deep sadness in that. A lighthouse is built to make danger visible. Its purpose is warning. Its beam tells ships where not to go. It turns darkness into information. But on a December day in 1900, the danger may have come too close, too fast, and from the wrong direction. The men who kept the warning light were themselves beyond warning. We are left with small facts: a missing light, a delayed relief boat, a closed door, clean lamps, unmade beds, a set of oilskins left behind, damage at the West Landing, 3 absent men, an official report, no final witness. And so the mystery has lasted, not because there are no explanations, but because the most likely explanation still leaves us standing at the edge of the island, looking down at the water, trying to imagine the final minutes without ever truly seeing them. For James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur, the Flannan Isles were not a legend. They were a workplace, a duty, a stretch of winter days before relief arrived. Their names are the center of the story, not the rumors, not the myths, not the dramatic details added later, just 3 men, a lighthouse, and the Atlantic. And somewhere in the silence between December 15th and December 26th, 1900, the light went out. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. Tonight's case was the Flannan Isles Lighthouse Mystery, the 1900 disappearance of James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald McArthur from Eilean Mòr in Scotland's Outer Hebrides. As you rest, let the story settle where it belongs, not in fear, but in remembrance. A small island, a winter sea, a light built to guide others safely home, and 3 men whose final moments remain unknown, but whose names have not been lost. Sleep well, and take care.